So there's some new faces today, welcome. As some of you know, I speak a lot, and that can be misinterpreted as being too much intellect. That this search, this movement, is about dropping out of thinking, and that thinking is the problem. And to some extent that's very accurate. This is about finding a place, or from different terminologies, different teachings, a no place, whatever. We come to a place inside of us, the core of the human being, we can say, that doesn't require thought in order for it to exist. We could say it exists prior to thinking. It's a recognition of our true nature at our core that is timeless and infinite, a recognition of the core of the human being that doesn't have a personality, doesn't have age or a gender. And yet, when we find ourselves resting there, there's something undeniable. And that undeniability is the sense that I am, I exist. It's this sense of existence that turns out in the end to be the thing that allows us to live life happily. And when I use the word happy in this teaching, I don't mean happy in the form of a sensation, not happy in the form of excitement or even bliss, but in this teaching, happiness is very specifically synonymous with peace of mind. So peace of mind in daily living. And what is peace of mind specifically? Specifically, peace of mind isn't something added. It's simply the absence of something, the absence of suffering. And suffering, when we look at it, is purely a mind-based activity. And in its very concentrated form, it's a feeling. And this suffering has a very unique characteristic to it. This characteristic permeates all of the different forms of suffering. And that characteristic is an uncomfortableness with oneself, an uncomfortableness with the other, an uncomfortableness with life. So hopefully we can start to use these concepts that I'm putting forward as guides to illuminate our experiential landscape in a way that maybe hasn't been seen before. So this is not a top-down approach. It's not an approach that points at our core being. It's an approach that looks at what's happening that covers up this core being. And this doesn't mean that it needs to be exclusively bottom up or top down. We can find our process can involve the integration of the two. And if that starts happening, we have a very powerful process that's happening. A process that at times is inquiring into the nature of daily living, and the intellect is actually part of that inquiry. Contemplation effectively is a form of thinking. And so from that perspective, we can see that thinking is not the problem. Thinking can be part of the solution. If it is believed to be exclusively part of the solution, or the solution itself, then we get into a problem. The thinking is hopefully taking us beyond certain types of thinking, a place where we can rest in our being, become familiar with that, and then find ourselves functioning as a human being in daily life. Very often we expect that this transformation, if it's ever going to be complete, or if it is complete, that the human being disappears. And this expectation can maybe keep us in a certain part of the process. We might actually feel like it's a part of the process that we have to keep just going deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And if we go deeper and deeper and deeper into it, then eventually that will be the solution. But from my experience, the process takes us into a recognition of the core of our being, a recognition of awareness and the sense of existence. And then the process kicks us out of there and says, hey, you're meant to live your life as a human being. How can you integrate that understanding, that recognition, back into being human? And so the teaching here focuses on daily living. And it starts off by suggesting that if we find ourselves seekers, seeking sometimes for many, many years, we should at some point ask ourselves a very important question. And that question is, what am I really looking for? Not some theory about what I'm looking for, but the question needs to be asked, what am I looking for practically, so that I can come up with a really practical answer, an answer that I've come up with for myself based on a practical exploration. It's very easy to get lost in theory. So even though there's a lot of words, at any point feel free to just drop into being if that's accessible. If the mind says, I've listened to enough, and we rest in being, that's more than fine. Actually, all the words are pointing to that place. It's also pointing to the place of being such that we can then take it out into daily life and not lose it. So the answer to the question, this is the suggested answer, don't believe it and then leave it at that, but it can be used as a guide. I would suggest don't stop asking this question until you come up with this answer for yourself, based on your own investigation. So the question is, what am I really looking for in life in practical terms? And the suggested answer is, actually what we're really looking for when we drop all sorts of ideas, we just want to be happy. Happy in life. And we might not know what this happiness looks like. But the fact is that all of our movement in life is happening because we believe that once we get something we're after, it'll make us happy. Remember, happiness turns out not to necessarily be what we believe it to be. So humanity has been seeking for happiness, and very clearly, if we observe how this seeking happens and in which direction it happens, it's clear that there's a deeply ingrained belief that says my happiness is to be found in outcomes. My happiness is to be found in pleasure, in circumstance. And because of that, we spend our whole life trying to control life. In essence, not being okay with how life turns out. And we all have our own experience that tells us, I can't control life. Even though I get what I want sometimes, there are other times that I don't get what I want. So the suggestion here is that life is a creation of source or consciousness. And we could describe this movement as consciousness at rest, pure potential creativity, and the important word there is potential. So consciousness in its unmanifest form, potentiality at some point has to manifest. If it didn't manifest at some point, it wouldn't be potentiality. And what we experience is the manifestation. So that's it in theory, and at some point when the manifestation exhausts itself for this particular story, this particular creation, Source returns to its resting form. Consciousness at rest, or Source at rest, explodes into manifestation, consciousness in movement, and at some point returns to consciousness at rest. If we want to take a big picture view, we could say that consciousness at rest has turned into the story of time. And in this case, a story of time and space and duality. What that means is that on an experiential level, the story is a story of cause and effect, a story of me and others. Now, the realization is not a realization that needs to change the story of life on an experiential level. The realization is a realization of the fundamental nature of life, the fundamental nature of life as a non-duality, as a single appearance, as an experience which ultimately is one experience, and so there is no separation, but in practice, in experience, on the experiential level, is an experience designed to be of many. And so if we're waiting for the experience to one day change, such that it becomes experienced as a non-duality, we might be waiting for something that isn't available. What is very much available are peak experiences that demonstrate the non-dual nature of life. And they can come and they can be there for an extended period of time. And at some point they fade away. And often when that experience of oneness fades away, our conclusion is, oh, I've lost something, I've lost this oneness. Often when the oneness experiences come, the concepts that have been delivered before suggest that that is reality, and that the experience of duality is illusion. And so obviously when a peak experience happens, then the conclusion is, oh, this is reality. And actually the state isn't what's so important, but it's how life is experienced. So at some point along the way, a peak experience of oneness happened. And in that experience, everything that was described in the teachings that I was heavily immersed in at the time was demonstrated. And it didn't require any thinking. It was demonstrated so immediately, at no distance, that I became convinced that that was enlightenment. And when it faded away, nothing inside of me drew any other conclusion other than to say that was enlightenment, and one day it will come back and stay like that forever. And fortunately, I had, by that time, met my teacher, Ramesh, who was the translator for Nisargadatta. And I mentioned that because the teachings I was immersed in were the teachings of Nisargadatta, the teachings of I Am That. And they were instrumental in bringing about a shift, a recognition that wasn't seen before. And then after that recognition, a recognition which provided a subtle sense that nothing is separate from anything else. So a subtle knowing or being that recognized that anything that was observed actually was not separate from the awareness that observed it. And so a subtle sense of oneness existed. Then after that, this really profound oneness experience that was far more sharp than what I just described happened. And then I thought, wow, this is it. This is enlightenment. And so I got on an aeroplane and went to see Ramesh. And he saw me sitting in satsang. He said, "Oh, Roger, hi. What have you got to share?" And I said, "Well," and here I went. I described this experience. And I used all the right terminology, and I think I did a pretty good job of describing what this experience was all about. And at that time, there was no way I would use the word experience to describe it. It was the absence of experience. It was the falling away of subject-object relationship in the most profound way. There was a recognition that what I am was not localized in the body, a realization that if something came and attacked the body, it wouldn't touch what I was, that which was aware of everything and intrinsically part and not separate from everything. And I did a much better job at explaining it, because back then the mind had been conditioned in this other way of seeing life that way, which is what contributed to that experience. And so after listening to my description, Ramesh said, "Roger, don't worry about it, that was just an experience." Actually, the other way around. "Roger, that was just an experience, don't worry about it." And nothing inside of me resonated with that. So I decided I'll try and fix my explanation, my description. So I added some more words. And he said, "Roger, that was an experience, just an experience, don't worry about it." So I had one last attempt. And the third time, "Roger, that was just an experience, don't worry about it." And so I left, concluding, actually, maybe he doesn't know. Maybe he hasn't had this enlightenment. And maybe what he's talking about is something very different. And it was only, having said that, at that time I was quite well versed in what the teaching was. I really did understand it. But then something like this happens, and it has the effect of maybe throwing us off track a little bit. So my mind went, this is it. And it was several weeks later that I started to notice this yearning, this longing for this oneness experience to come back. And several weeks after that again, it became very clear that suffering was now starting to happen. I'd go on the same walk every morning, waiting. As I came to the same location, I was waiting for it to happen again. And it didn't. The subtle recognition that everything was actually not separate was still there. And what I hadn't realized is that peace was largely I had realized it, peace was largely my experience. And that was what allowed me to realize when the suffering started coming up from this yearning for something more, yearning for a oneness to come back on a continuous, unbroken basis. And it was the realization of the suffering that had come back in this yearning that opened my mind up to the question, maybe Ramesh was right. What if he's right? What if that was just an experience? Don't worry about it. And in that moment I saw that I had an expectation about what enlightenment was, an expectation that was fueled by an experience that didn't feel like an experience. It was interpreted to me by me as reality. And that's when the core of the teaching came. What are you really looking for in practical terms? And the core of the teaching says, what we're really looking for is happiness. Happiness turns out to be peace of mind. Peace of mind regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in. And peace of mind in its inverse description is simply the absence of suffering, not the gaining of anything. And I realized that this thinking that was happening, this expectation, was a form of suffering. And that's when it became clear, actually, I'm just looking for the end of suffering. And if that's available, living as Roger in life, experiencing myself as separate from the other, experiencing myself as this human being, then I don't care about a oneness experience. In practical terms, I'm just looking for happiness in this life for Roger. Now that might sound selfish, but practically, why do people give up the rat race and then start deciding to dedicate their life to something that seems more noble? Because they found that searching after outcomes and money doesn't deliver happiness. But maybe if I dedicate myself to something more noble, something more humanitarian, then I'll get happiness that way. And we find, no, that's not going to give you happiness. We start seeking truth or enlightenment. Why? Because deep down we believe, I'll be happy when that happens. So if we become clear that this happiness is simply living life without suffering, then maybe we don't need a oneness experience. Now, in the oneness experience, there was clearly no suffering. That was what made it so tricky. And when there was an opening up to the possibility that happiness could be available without a oneness experience, then that was great. I just needed to continue focusing on the type of thinking that delivered this suffering. And why is it that human happiness is available on a continuous, unbroken basis? The answer is simple. It's available on a continuous, unbroken basis because the unhappiness that arises is based on an error, based on a deeply ingrained set of beliefs that turn into a self-image. So a set of beliefs that tell us what we are, a set of beliefs that tell us what we are that is not really what we are. And so when these beliefs get dissolved, the error that stems from them dissolves with it. And so what is the set of beliefs that is ingrained? What is the set of beliefs that's ingrained and can get dissolved? In practical terms, the belief is, I am the doer and the other is the doer. And my happiness is to be found in outcomes. Now, what do I mean by the belief I am the doer? The belief I am the doer is an attitude to life that sees everything that happens through this body-mind organism and through the other body-mind organisms as my doing and the other's doing, meaning my creation and the other's creation. It sees the thinking and the feelings and the actions as my feelings, my thinking, my actions. And the belief in attachment to outcomes is a belief that relates to outcomes as if they are something that will add or subtract from who I am. So with this deeply ingrained set of beliefs, I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, that essentially becomes an identity that meets life. And when life unfolds as it's destined to unfold, which is always either pleasure or pain, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. When life unfolds in a way that is painful, the reaction that happens internally is a reaction of resistance. The reaction is a reaction of that self-image that receives the pain, and the belief is my completeness is attacked by pain. That pain is an attack on who I am. Circumstance is an attack on who I am. And so with that deeply ingrained belief, the reaction of resistance is not optional. It's not something we can work hard at preventing. It's a simple cause and effect relationship. And the reason that that gets put in place is not because I as a doer have put the belief in place, but rather because life has conditioned the human being a particular way. So what is the human being? The human being on a biological and psychological level. Now, biological and psychological level means the level on which we act in life, the way we think and feel. All of that is a combination of our biological and psychological makeup. And the human being on a biological and psychological level is based on two factors: our genes and our up-to-date conditioning. And these two factors are factors that we've never been in control of. We didn't choose the genes that we have. That simply means the makeup of the body as a piece of hardware. That, you know, a sperm and an egg came together according to the causal explanation of how the body grows. And then it grows, and it continues to grow, and we don't luckily have to put our attention on the arm growing a certain way or the heart developing. It grows, and at some point it starts working. So the body on a genetic level is a piece of hardware, and it starts getting conditioned by life, moment after moment after moment. And each moment is new conditioning, and the cumulative new conditioning in each moment becomes what we can call our up-to-date conditioning. So at any particular point in time, the human being on a biological and psychological level is one way. The way we are, based on two factors that we've never been in control of. The analogy that some of you have heard me use is like two chemicals that have a particular composition, and they come together in a circumstance, and there's a reaction. And the chemicals don't choose how they're going to react. They don't sit down and have a conference. It just happens based on their chemical composition. Sometimes two chemicals come together and there's an inert reaction, and other times it's a very violent reaction. And human beings at any point in time are like a complex version of that. And we find ourselves in a circumstance which might include meeting another very complex version of the chemicals. We come together and there's a reaction. Now, I'm not using the word reaction as a bad reaction, anything. So someone says hello and you say hello back. That's a reaction based on the circumstance and our genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if we can find a third factor that determines how we function on a biological and psychological level, then this theory sort of falls flat. But I'm sure that if you investigate this for yourself, so all of these concepts I'm putting forward are here as pointers, as guides, not to be believed, but to be investigated. And the great thing is they can be investigated based on your own experience in daily living. We're not talking about something that happens on Mars. All of these explanations about our own landscape in daily living. So this can seem, the concept is simple. If we really come to see that we're not the doers in each moment, the other isn't the doer in the way that we've been conditioned by life to believe, meaning life has put in place certain up-to-date conditioning that includes this set of false beliefs. I am the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. If we really start to see life's not the way I thought it was, I, on a biological and psychological level, function automatically based on two factors I'm not in control of. If I had a low IQ, if I'm given a low IQ, I can't solve a complicated equation. And that doesn't make me a failure. It makes me what I am, which is not in my control. And if we start seeing ourselves this way and seeing the other this way, what falls away is a whole lot of suffering. Suffering in daily living, in practical terms, arises in the form of guilt, blame, and pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. These are the mental movements that disturb our peace of mind. These are the mental movements that cover up this core of the human, cover up a recognition of the core of the human. So while the core of the human is covered up, I can't know myself fully. It ends up that I know an image of myself which is highly inaccurate based on an investigation of life. Now, this approach that I'm describing is not some new approach. This non-doership is referred to in Shankara's teaching, in Buddha's teaching. The Buddha said there are events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. In the Bhagavad Gita, the story of Arjuna and Krishna, when Arjuna finds himself facing his enemy and he realizes that his enemy is his friends, his family, his teachers and gurus and mentors, he says to Krishna, "My friends and relatives I might be able to fight, but my mentors and gurus I can't." And Krishna's counseling to him was, you are a warrior, you must fight. Meaning you are designed a particular way, you have to function according to your design. And as time, I have already killed them, indicating that life is a story, a creation of time and space. And the whole story of life, the whole story of time already exists. So Krishna is essentially saying, you are an instrument that I have included in the story of time, and I am going to function through you in order to bring about the consequence that has already happened. So life is a predetermined story, unfolding in each moment exactly as it's created to unfold. And what we experience is life from a particular perspective. Life from the perspective of this instrument. So what is the human being? The human being is a body-mind organism into which the impersonal consciousness of Source has linked and is functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. So personal consciousness is the experience you're having right now. The experience we're always having through life. And that experience only ever happens now. Whatever that content happens to be, is the personal consciousness experience of life. And that personal consciousness experience of life only happens because the impersonal consciousness of Source is functioning through the instrument, a bit like electricity plugged into 4 different appliances. You have a fan, you have a fridge, a heater, and something else. And it's the one undifferentiated source or energy that plugs into all of the appliances. It functions through the appliance based on the appliance's unique makeup. A particular output comes out. The output is exactly according to the makeup and the programming of that machine. And what enlivens it is the source functioning through it. Another analogy we could use is red filter and white light. And when the white light passes through the red filter, red light comes out. So red light is effectively the byproduct of the white light and the filter combined. So the personal consciousness experience, the experience that we call our experience, is actually the experience that God or Source is having in each moment. God doesn't experience life from out there. like looking at it from CCTV or from out there. This is how close God is. There's no separation between me and God. I am an expression of God. Everyone else is an expression of God. Don't get me wrong, don't think I'm saying I am, only I am. If awareness turns inwards, and we're looking for God out there, it's closer than close. What is aware of the experience? This awareness that functions through the body. And with the awareness there is this undeniable sense of I am, I exist. And if the movements of the body start to be understood by the working mind, which is part of the body. So what I'm putting forward here is new conditioning. And that new conditioning can become part of our up-to-date conditioning. And so our up-to-date conditioning is not the problem, it's only part of our up-to-date conditioning that's the problem. The part which we could call the thinking mind. The thinking mind, which is based on these false beliefs that I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcome, that part of the conditioning is an error. And it's the thinking mind, and all of the suffering stems from the conditioning which we can call the thinking mind. When that conditioning dissolves, then the suffering that stems from the thinking mind, meaning all of that thinking that in practical terms is guilt, blame and pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome, all of that stops when the conditioning of the thinking mind falls away. When that conditioning of the thinking mind falls away, the working mind remains. The body still remains a conditioned instrument, thankfully. If all of our conditioning got removed, we would no longer know how to use a knife and fork, no longer know how to drive a car or a scooter, no longer know how to walk or talk or think. So a lot of our up-to-date conditioning is not at all a problem. It's essential in order for daily living to continue to happen. So what we're doing here is we're sort of narrowing our attention onto what's really important to see, to start seeing things as they really are. Always coming back to this question, what am I really looking for? And the answer in practice, actually, I just want to be happy. What does happiness for the human being look like? The continuous, unbroken happiness that's available. It looks like peace of mind regardless of circumstance. And that peace of mind regardless of circumstance means the absence of certain mentation, certain thinking that is so often triggered when circumstance is painful. And as this becomes, these concepts become ticked off for ourselves in daily living, meaning if the working mind becomes adequately programmed with the concept, as life unfolds, we'll start seeing them in action. So one of the concepts says that the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain, and that our happiness is not to be found on the level of the flow of life, but rather to be found on the level of our attitude to the flow of life. And so as we find ourselves carrying on our living, in whichever form that takes, whether we're here on pilgrimage or whether we're going to work, this investigation, this exploration can happen. So if we're walking along the street and we stub our toe, the thought might arise, this is pain in the moment. Part of the flow of life. The flow of life is either pleasurable or painful. If we see an amazing sunset, the thought might, this is pleasure in the moment. So pleasure and pain fall into the categories of physical pleasure or pain, emotional pleasure or pain, financial pleasure or pain. If I go to book an airline ticket and I check online and it's $400, and I think, oh, that's good, I'll book this tomorrow. And tomorrow I get online, it's $600. That's an example of financial pain. And if it dropped down to $300, that would be financial pleasure. If someone came in, or someone here, which you're more than welcome to do, is put in your comments and your questions, and there's a microphone, I think we're recording, so I'll pass the microphone around, and someone says, actually, I think what you're saying is a load of nonsense. I mean, my preference would be someone says, you know, what you've said has been amazingly illuminating. Now, based on my biological preferences, one is better than the other. One is more pleasurable than the other. So that's what makes something pleasurable versus painful. Not our psychology of how we relate to it. That's part of our peace or our suffering. But what makes something pleasurable or painful is dependent on the particular circumstance and our biological preferences, which are part of the body. So this idea that pleasure and pain is only because you label things, to me it has its place, it's useful, but when we start looking at it, really, when you put something that tastes good into your mouth, there's a sensation that according to the biological makeup of the body, the preferences of the body, is pleasurable, not because of a thought, but because of the biological preferences of the body. So if you put your hand under boiling hot water, sure, it's just sensation, but when the hand moves away automatically, because biologically it's painful. And if the water is just the right temperature, the body might stay there for more time than is ideal according to some other standard. Let's say someone else having a warm shower. So what makes something pleasurable or painful is the biological preference of the body. And so the concept says that our happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, meaning our happiness isn't dependent on whether life is pleasurable or painful. The deeply ingrained belief says my happiness, my completeness is to be found in life being pleasure, 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 pleasure. That's what the deeply ingrained belief about who we are says. That's part of the misunderstanding of who we are. So as we find ourselves moving through life and someone takes our fruit or knocks over our bottle of water and we happen to be thirsty, the thought might arise only if the thought will only arise if the working mind is appropriately conditioned. The thought might arise, this is pain in the moment, which means we're starting to see the landscape as it really is. If someone comes up and offers you a piece of fruit and you take it and you eat it, and oh, that's really pleasurable. Now, this is not the point is not that we go around labeling everything forever. It's just that this understanding starts to go deeper and deeper in order for the landscape to become known. And when it's really known that the flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain, then the labeling stops and the pleasure or pain remains. Why it's important to know that the flow of life is only ever pleasure or pain, and that my happiness is not dependent on pleasure or pain, is because there's a misunderstanding deeply ingrained that says the opposite. There's an understanding that says life needs to be a particular way in order for me to be happy, in order for me to be complete. And for as long as that relationship to life carries on, the part of ourself that is already complete, always complete, the part that is unaffected by the pleasure or pain, doesn't get recognized. And so, if life turns out painful in a particular moment, and the thinking mind starts to blame the other for what they have done that is painful. At some point, the working mind will kick in and say, this is blame. This is a form of suffering. This is based on the false belief, I am the doer and the other is the doer. That thought's only going to arise if we've become appropriately conditioned to see this way. So let's look once again at the suffering as it arises in daily life. Guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So when the other in the story of life delivers pain, that pain is interpreted as an attack on who I am. And because I see myself as a separate independent entity and the other as a separate independent entity, blame arises. I blame you for what you did that hurt me. I hate you for what you did that hurt me. That attitude to what happened in the flow of life. The attitude is our suffering. The circumstance isn't our suffering. The circumstance is either pleasure or pain. The attitude to the circumstance is our suffering. And this attitude of doership can lock in place a huge burden of guilt and blame that we carry around with us. A huge load of expectation and regret. As soon as life starts to be seen as a happening, unfolding according to God's will, not my doing, not the other's doing, I am intrinsically part of the story, part of the happening. And how I function on a biological and psychological level is dictated by my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I didn't put in place. In each moment, I'm forced on a biological and psychological level to function one way. However it is I function in that moment. So these are just descriptions of what happens in life. And so Ramesh would often say, make no mistake, what's being delivered here is simply new conditioning. New conditioning which is radically different from the conditioning that life tends to deliver. Life, in daily life, not often do you get told, you're not the doer. The other isn't the doer. In daily life, we tend to receive very different conditioning from our family, from our friends, from political culture, religious culture. And so this new conditioning, like any conditioning that's delivered moment after moment after moment, has the effect of adding to or radically changing our up-to-date conditioning. And so if we find blame arising, and then the working mind cuts off the blame, that wouldn't be my doing, but rather a happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So any arguments we've got into in the past, any shortcomings that we have in the past or in the present. So this understanding isn't going to make us perfect human beings. This understanding, this attitude to life, is going to make us accepting human beings. We'll accept our shortcomings and the other's shortcomings. Accept them because we no longer see them as my doing and the other, and understand they couldn't have happened any other way. So as we notice our uncomfortableness with life, my suggestion is the more that we look at it, we'll find that it is always arising in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, or attachment to outcome. And when we look at those different forms of suffering, the root, the ground on which that suffering arises from, is this ingrained belief, I am the doer, the other is the doer, and that my happiness, my completeness is dependent on outcomes. when we come in contact with the aspect of ourself that I was talking about earlier, the aspect of ourself that is unrecognized, it has two main characteristics: characteristic of awareness and the characteristic of being, or existence, or I am. And in Ramana's great teaching, that's referred to as self with a capital S. So when he says, inquire into who am I, it's about an exploration that might start off, who am I? And we might come up with answers that are answers about the physical only. And as we're guided beyond that, we're being guided towards a recognition of the core of the human being. And when we get the answer, we don't get the answer mentally. We get the answer because there's a dropping into being, resting in a place that is prior to all of the thinking of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. An allowance, a place where we allow life to be as it is. So that quality of awareness effectively witnesses life happening, witnesses life as an experience that is continually changing. And from that perspective of witnessing, it becomes known that this witnessing is never affected by what is happening. So from a causal point of view, once the body is seen to be essentially a biological instrument functioning in each moment exactly the way it's designed to function, then the body is witnessed. It's seen that anger arises in a body-mind organism, or compassion arises in a body-mind organism. Speaking happens in a body-mind organism. And so life is then allowed to flow. And what prevents life from flowing is this attitude of involvement in what's happening. This attitude that says life should be different, it could be different. I should have been different. I should have acted differently. You, definitely, having delivered pain to me, should have and could have been different. And when that story falls away, life continues to unfold, the body continues to function, the story of life continues to play out, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. But now the load of guilt and blame, the suffering, falls away, and what's left is a connection to our core, which reveals our connection to Source, where it becomes clear that whatever happens through the body is actually Source functioning through the body. And it's the one Source functioning through all of us. So from this perspective, even if the other delivers pain, it's understood that the pain is my destiny in the moment, and it was the destiny of the other to act a certain way in order to deliver pain in this moment. This way, my relationship to the other is no longer one of competition and rivalry and anonymity, but one of seeing ourselves as universal brothers and sisters in a game of life, a story of life. Not accepting life and accepting pain because it's inevitable, that's one part of it, but also accepting it because there's this connection to a part of ourself that remains untouched by the circumstance. A part of us that is always there. I am. I exist. When suffering happens, there's an involvement in the pleasure or pain, and that involvement is effectively a whole lot of thinking that says, I'm being attacked. And in any moment, if we just stop and drop into being, we find, I am. And then it starts to become experientially clear that this involvement in life is simply covering up our true being. We experientially come to know what I am at my core is not affected by pleasure or pain. Pain exists. Something painful happens. For a time, an involvement in the pain happens and our peace is cut off. It feels like I'm being attacked. And in the moment that that suffering gets cut off and we drop into being, that's when we go, I still am untouched at my core, even with the circumstance being unfortunate. This is a principle that applies to all of life. If the principle is understood, is seen, not just understood intellectually, that's the beginning, and then the process goes deeper and deeper and deeper as we start to see it, and we start to see life, and we wonder, how did I not see this before? It's so obvious when it becomes obvious. And as the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, what we find is the suffering starts to get cut off quicker and quicker and quicker until, and at some point when the understanding is total, we find ourselves moving through life with suffering no longer being able to arise. And this doesn't have to happen as some sudden flash of understanding. This can be something gradual. There can be a flash where we say, when we realize, I simply cannot be the doer. The other simply cannot be the doer. That's the understanding going deeper and deeper and deeper. And we'll notice something very practical happening. We'll notice that suffering starts to get less and less as the understanding goes deeper and deeper. And then one day it might come to our mind, actually I can't remember suffering for a while. We might not even be able to put our finger on it. When did it happen? Was it 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago? 6 years ago? 7 years ago? But in practice, something very significant has been delivered, the end of suffering. So, what will enlightenment deliver that we didn't have before? Before enlightenment, there is a person with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, meaning a person that is disconnected from the core of their being, a person that believes themselves to be a separate, independent entity, sees the other as separate, independent entities. After liberation, what remains is a person no longer with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, meaning a person that has an unbroken recognition of their connection to Source. The understanding that whatever happens through me has to happen because Source is functioning through me. Whatever happens through the other has to happen because Source is functioning through the other. And this unbroken connection to Source is where our peace comes from. So in practical terms, enlightenment delivers continuous unbroken peace of mind in daily living. So you might wonder, well, why I talk for so long. If I said, so, who's got some questions at the beginning of the satsang? There could be lots of questions and they have no context. So now there's a context. Can you pass the microphone that way? Do people want the air conditioning turned off? Or is it okay? It's okay?
Okay, so you have explained in detail what it is to be an enlightened being. And if we are all here totally understanding what you're saying and having experienced much of it, even some of the at oneness experiences that our gurus have told us to forget.
Yep.
Are we then enlightened in this time, at this time, in these moments when we are totally understanding and have experienced?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're not waiting for something else. We are in the process each moment of living an enlightened life.
Yeah, so if in the moment when there is no suffering, we could say that's peace of mind in that moment. The definition of enlightenment according to this teaching, so I'll talk about that in a second, is enlightenment is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. So if we find ourselves living life, going through the day, waking up the next day, going through the day, and so on, with no suffering arising, then at some point we might realize, especially, you know, it could just be a thought, an expectation that it's something different to this, that keeps just a little bit of suffering in place. And it could be just a shift in that belief system that gets us to realize, actually, I don't need anything more than I have. What I have is life with no suffering. And frankly, even when I say it's continuous, unbroken peace of mind, if you have a minute of suffering and it gets cut off, who cares? So even the idea that it has to be absolute, and if you have a second of it's not, I don't have it. Like, that would be the thinking mind coming in. You know, it happens, and it's a happening. It arises. If there's some suffering, it arises, and if it gets cut off, in effect, it almost is like unbroken peace of mind. So we go, who cares that there's a glimpse of suffering from time to time? In theory, you could say if the suffering arises just for a second, you could say the understanding is not total, because the suffering has had something to arise from. But you really would go, well, when it's going to be total, it's going to be total. That's a great attitude to have, whatever your amount of suffering is. The fact is that we're not even in control of our attitude. Our attitude to life is part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, part of the story of life. And so we will suffer for as long as the story of life has suffering included in it, our story of life. And to the extent that we understand this to be the case, then the suffering is allowed to arise and subside. Even if it hangs around for an extended period of time, if it's destined and this understanding is there, it'll be seen as a happening and no secondary suffering of guilt or resistance to it arising. But these pointers are never, nothing that I'm putting forward is intended as a prescription. A prescription would mean you can do this. You as a separate individual entity, you as a doer. So all that's being put forward are descriptions. Descriptions that take the form of concepts, and those concepts essentially are just part of new conditioning that life is throwing out. And so life throws out new conditioning, which is always how it has changed us. And when the new conditioning becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning in a particular way, what we find is that the old conditioning gets dissolved. But we're not in control of the new conditioning that gets delivered, and we're not in control of how it becomes integrated. And so we're not in control of how it changes the psychological conditioning of the thinking mind. And yet, even if we're not in control, we still have to live life as if we're in control. So the story of life undoubtedly has us facing a situation, and in the situation there is this great component in the experience of life, which is the feeling of free will. And so even though we're not the doers in practice, in theory or in practice, so what I mean by in theory we're not the doers, because in theory whatever we do is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, and in practice, once we've done something, the outcome is not in our control. Sometimes we get what we want and sometimes we don't. So both in theory and in practice we're not in control, and yet in the moment there is this gift, which is the feeling of free will. So we find ourselves facing a fork in the road, and there is a feeling I can go to the left or to the right, which we end up choosing. Going to the right, I would say, is a result of the circumstance we found ourselves in and our genes and up-to-date conditioning. Or we could just say, I went to the right because it's part of the story of life. I was destined to go to the right. But in the moment, there is the gift of free will, which is really a feeling of free will. It doesn't mean that this feeling of free will gives us control.
Feeling of freedom?
Free will.
Free will. Okay.
Feeling of free will. Because often our definition about free will is, well, free will means I am in control. In this case, I'm using the word free will as a feeling of free will, which is really a gift. I wouldn't want the feeling of free will to get eradicated. This is the paradox, is we can have the feeling of free will knowing I'm not the doer. So a deep attitudinal knowing that everything is a happening, and yet in practice I don't deny the sense that there is this feeling that I have free will in each moment.
Well, about 30, 35 years ago, I had this guru who would end his satsangs by saying, "This very moment, the lotus paradise." Right? So whenever I'm in beautiful places, sitting on the beach or whatever, I'm like, oh, this very moment, the lotus paradise. Mm-hmm. So the other day I had the experience walking down these filthy streets with all the noise and beggars, and I suddenly realized this very moment, and I'm like, this very moment, the lotus paradise, but it was like, yes, this very moment. So that was wonderful.
Yeah. Yes, just a change of perspective. Thank you. Just to put it into context, the suffering that might continue to arise even when we start to understand I'm not the doer. It just means that there's the old belief system still in place and the new belief system also in place. They're having a battle. Eventually the new understanding will uproot the misunderstanding that remains in the system. And we can start using words in Ramana's teaching. This refers to the vasanas and samskaras. So the old belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. So attachment to outcome drives our craving, drives our desire. And this deep belief that I need this in order to be complete. And so we find ourselves functioning automatically. And so what I'm just trying to highlight by showing that there's actually not, it might sound like these are worlds apart, but actually it's talking about the same thing in different, so from a slightly different angle. Sometimes the pointers here can be interpreted as, not spiritual. I know when I went and first listened to Ramesh, I thought I've turned up at kindergarten spirituality after having very profound experiences or realizations that were being pointed at by the top-down teachings. And then I heard this and I thought, I don't need to know this. And at some point it became really clear that I wasn't seeing life on a causal level particularly accurately. There were certain ideas of the fundamental nature of things. And so there was still a lot of intellectual misunderstandings that started to get corrected by the concepts which described the flow of life much better than I had come across before. Total clarity and accuracy. And often I'd resist, go, no, that's not right, that's not right. And I wanted to stick to my way of seeing it. And each time I was shown, no, this description is much more accurate. Much more accurate description of the dynamics of how life unfolds. So, for example, the nuance of free will being there, the feeling of free will, when we come to see that life is predetermined, or that life is just happening, and that what seems like my choice is part of the happening. What seems like my choice is actually not my choice. Then we might, this is what happened for me, is we'll say, I have no free will. And that's what that's really saying, is that what happens isn't my doing. And I missed the fact that, actually still with that understanding that it's not my doing, there is still this feeling of free will. And when the intellect doesn't recognize that, it hasn't seen things completely as they are. And so that nuance, for me, changed certain things. If that feeling of free will wasn't there and we recognized that life was a happening, which is what the sort of the witnessing perspective shows us. If free will, the feeling of free will got removed, actually the experience would be terrible. It would feel like we're a slave or like a puppet at the end of a string. We'd feel like we were in prison, being shoved around. And that's not the experience. The experience is I'm free in each moment to do exactly what I think or feel to do. Understanding that what I think or feel to do actually is not my doing. That's where the paradox, that's where the integration comes in. Does someone know what the time is? Sure. Just for the recording, if you don't mind.
Well, first I'm curious, after the experiences that Ramesh told you, they're just experiences, like in the melodrama of life, what happened later? And what brings you to give satsangs? Like,
right, yeah. Yeah, good question. So the process carried on, and at some point everything seemed to click into place. I have to say, for most of my life I had very little suffering before even seeking. My life happened to be not filled with sort of heavy sort of suffering that other people's experience includes, for which I have to say I'm very grateful. I assumed that life was about achieving things. That, I guess, would have been my suffering, although it wasn't. It's not a type of suffering that is particularly heavy. At some point I was achieving or doing things thinking it was about getting more and promotions at work and whatever, and it became very clear it's not about that. And so the process continued to dissolve that form of suffering. And at some point, the seeking simply stopped. And that point was when it was really clear what I'm really looking for is simply peace of mind in daily living. And I found I had peace of mind in daily living. And that peace of mind remained unbroken. So my experience is that life continues to unfold and there is unbroken peace of mind. And for some time I was giving satsang here and there as it fit into my sort of lifestyle. And a series of events started happening where I started giving satsang in India quite regularly. But I didn't really want to do any more than that, because I was really quite happy with my life. It was very enjoyable. And frankly, I thought if I'm giving satsang and sitting at the front of a room with many people, my life is going to change. And so I, for some years, did it when it suited me. And then I started having these strange sensations, physical sensations, whenever I would talk about the subject. And because I was always aware and interested in dynamics and relationships, I thought maybe I'm not meant to be talking about this subject. Maybe that's why I'm feeling these energetic pains in my body when I talk to someone or something like that. So at the time I was in Goa, and there were people that knew that I giving satsang, so they were asking me, and I said, no, I'm not talking about it. And it really felt good to be able to say no, and not feel like I have to share this message. And so for several months, I decided it's not my job to talk about this. And the pains actually started to subside. And then another feeling started to happen, a feeling that was, something doesn't feel right. And I started seeing a lot of what I call signs in life. And I started thinking about this topic of sharing. It kept coming up in a way that my attitude was very clearly, I'm not the doer, life is unfolding. And so this theme kept coming up about sharing and sitting on your talents. And at some point, after about a month of various different signs, I got the message. And the message was, Roger, you can't sit on this information. It's not part of the deal. And when that came through to me loud and clear, I said, okay, that's it, very simple. I got this message, so until life delivers a different message to me, I'm going to dedicate myself as fully as I can to doing this. And so within the space of a week, I went from the idea of having a website, a Facebook page, a YouTube channel, right? Those were the furthest things from what I wanted. As soon as this message came through, it was, okay, this is what I'm being told, that, and it made so, the way the message came through was this theme of sitting on your talents or gifts and sharing. And so it was okay, so I need a YouTube channel, I need a website, I need whatever. And that then began the next part of my life. And if the feeling arises today to never talk again, that's most likely what will happen.
So I have a continuing to the question. Mm-hmm. Like in some way, everyone is a seeker. Even some people consider themselves as spiritual seekers, but even people anywhere in the world, they seek happiness and comfort. Mm-hmm. As a human being born, I think everyone are looking for comfort and happiness. And then some go on spiritual seeking and meet different teachers. And I've heard from some, from more than one teacher, but for example, U.G. Krishnamurti, he's not the known one. The known one is Jiddu Krishnamurti, but the one who know U.G., which was kind of a crazy bastard kind of teacher. And he said that enlightenment is a calamity. He says that if we knew what it was, we would run away like crazy from that process. That it's definitely not a fun journey of happiness and bliss, that it's calamity, crazy pain at some point where the body is passing different transformations, and I don't know what do you mean, or I don't know Ramesh Balsakar. I just heard little about him, but so I don't know what he describes, but somehow just don't know what my question really is about that, but there's a feeling like we can stop just in everything's fine kind of thing. But I have this feeling and also a dread that reality is built not just by everything's fine and I'll have my nice life and I will not be disturbed, but that it's much more intense than that, and including as much pain as pleasure. But maybe to what I am it doesn't matter. But if this seeker, seeking happiness, would know what that means, maybe I would, run away, because it's calamity for this. So this is...
Yeah, there's a mix of things that come to me when you ask that question. One is, there's a reason why teachings say certain things. A teaching is always a methodology to try and get us to see things or to undo errors or obstacles. And like you said, everyone is a seeker. We're all seeking happiness. At first, we're seeking happiness through outcomes. And eventually, we find that happiness is never to be found in outcomes. Happiness is something very different to outcomes. It's equanimity, peace. And so the concept that says enlightenment won't give you anything, that's there to break a certain attitude of feeling like I need to get something out there. So a teaching that tells you, look, if you knew what it was going to give you, i.e. nothing, it's not going to give you anything, you wouldn't seek for it. So it's trying to break a certain attitude that seekers have at a certain point in time. Then there's another reason why he may say that, is that everyone's process is very different. And what gets delivered in the end can also be different, because the process it's always a moving process. And so there is awakening along the way, and awakening doesn't necessarily equate to liberation. So in the Gita there is a saying, don't mistake understanding for awakening, and or realization, don't mistake understanding for realization, and don't mistake realization for liberation. And so you can have people that have had realization, and that realization hasn't delivered liberation. Liberation is once the realization, which is the awakening to our true essence, once that has stabilized and the total implications of that have happened, that's when liberation is delivered. Liberation is the end of suffering. So between realization and liberation, there is still going to be suffering. And so when awakening happens, you can find someone able to talk very proficiently about the awakening. It doesn't necessarily mean that their process delivered them liberation. With Yuji, I can't help but have seen some videos at the end of his life, and he seemed just very bitter about how he had been treated in his life. So a bitterness seems to imply the opposite of the peace. It seems to imply the opposite of just a mental acceptance, but a being that is unaffected by the flow of life. Now, let's not focus on that. That's just something to consider. When he said that, it's a calamity. Was he speaking from a liberated point of view? Maybe just an awakened point of view. And the third point I'd like to make is that this process can include a lot of physical changes that are, some people are familiar with them as Kundalini moving through the body, and if certain blockages are there, it can be very painful. And so that could also be a reason why someone makes certain statements to say, this is not all peaches and cream. The process is not all peaches and cream. It can be painful. If you ask me from my perspective, I have to say, compared to what I hear, the process that happened for me was an amazing process with very few obstacles. It felt like a magic carpet come pick me up, and it unfolded. And if I had to do any of it, I would have messed it up in day 2, because the process was this amazing orchestration, like an amazing symphony, which is what makes me say life is this creation, this amazing creation. So if I'm talking from my perspective, the process itself was relatively smooth. Even the pains that I referred to were not unbearable pains. They were just things that were happening, headaches. And I thought, this is interesting. Why is this happening? So I changed, I experimented with a few things. Anyway, the process, that what's very clear is we don't end up with what we imagine we'll end up with. We could say we don't get anything. What that's pointing at, we don't get anything, is pointing that the process actually is the shedding, the dropping away of beliefs and the dropping away of suffering. So it's an amazingly simple and ordinary process. Well, the process is not simple. What's left is something really simple. I'm a human being in a world, from practical points of view. I have to live my life as this human being. The process of life is still going to be pleasure and pain, but it becomes very clear from an experiential point of view that the pleasure and pain, without the involvement in it, without the suffering, is far less of an issue than it appears to be when all the involvement is in it. So experientially, this peace of mind, this equanimity with life as it unfolds, however that happens to be, is an amazing gift. And at the same time, we'll express this amazing gift as something very simple and ordinary. Once again, this paradox. If you ask me, from my perspective, whether I would like to go back to living life as I did previously, I'm quite happy for life to continue to unfold as it is. If that gets turned into an expectation or a desire, the end of suffering can very much become a desire, then that desire is going to find the suffering, if it arises from time to time, unpalatable. And there'll be a resistance of that. So this is a description that enlightenment, according to this concept, is the end of suffering. It's not something to be turned into a prescription or a goal or an achievement. If it does, it'll become another obstacle that needs to be overcome. And life will do that. And let's also be clear, this is enlightenment according to this concept. There may well be a different enlightenment. We're just talking about enlightenment according to this explanation.
So if I could reflect back my understanding of this teaching, it seems that within the conditioning of the body and the mind, there can be wrinkles or obstacles to just a peaceful flow.
Mm-hmm.
And so concepts and inquiry that smooths that out for an appreciation of peace or beauty. It seems that those are valuable concepts worth introducing to the conditioning.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's about it. That's what and according to this perspective of life, there is not Roger as a separate independent doer introducing the concepts, but rather life flowing through me just like it's flowing through everyone. And so in this moment, life is this experience, the delivering of these concepts in this moment, and how they land and are integrated and change someone's up-to-date conditioning is not in my control or the other's control. So it's all happening. If we describe what effect it can have, it's exactly what you said. There's a body with certain up-to-date conditioning. That up-to-date conditioning can get in the way of peace of mind. And this set of concepts can, if it's destined, start to undo the up-to-date conditioning that is getting in the way of peace of mind. Yeah. So if there's no other comments or questions, I'm here till the 12th of January, excluding the 11th, so you're all welcome to come back again if you like. And if not, enjoy. Thank you.